My name is Jane Tyler. I direct the Humanities Initiative here at NYU, and it's a huge pleasure tonight to be kicking off our year with someone who I think exemplifies the kinds of things that we really try to do here at NYU at the Humanities Initiative, which is to embrace and to encourage and to stimulate interdisciplinary conversations that touch on not just humanistic topics, but subjects like the social sciences, the sciences, and our world. And our speaker tonight, Cathy Davidson, a real Renaissance woman, has shown herself to be capable of that and more. And I know you are as excited as I am to hear her. What makes tonight even more wonderful is that to introduce Professor Davidson, we have another Renaissance woman whose online book we were celebrating last year at our first event of the 2010-11 academic year. Her name is Kathleen Fitzpatrick. She was a visiting scholar last year at Steinhardt, as well as an honorary fellow at our Humanities Initiative Fellows Group. While she was here in New York on leave from Pomona College, she decided she had to stay here for a little bit longer, and she has recently taken on a job as the Director of Scholarly Communications at the Modern Language Association. Her book that we celebrated last year in its online version, Planned Obsolescence, is coming out in print with NYU Press in early November. So it's great to have Kathleen back for at least another year. It's wonderful to have Professor Davidson here. And to introduce our speaker, let me turn the mic over to Kathleen. Thank you so much for coming, and needless to say, we hope you will stick around for a reception to follow. Kathleen.
Thank you, Jane. Well, I juggle my technology. Cathy Davidson has recently been described as a visionary, helping us through a necessary rethinking of education in the 21st century, as a scholar with one of the most interesting and wide-ranging minds in contemporary scholarship, and as a true innovator in shaping the national conversation on digital media and learning. She has also been described as a youth-worshipping technophile, as evidence of everything that's gone wrong with education in the age of the iPod, and as, and this is a quote, just another radical Obama appointee. Cathy describes herself as a techno-pragmatist, one who doesn't expect technology to solve our problems, but who simultaneously understands that our educational system, by and large, is working to prepare today's students for yesterday's world, failing to acknowledge and work with the ways that new technologies create new forms of attention and knowledge creation. Now, I could keep you here for the rest of the evening simply by reciting a list of her major publications. Cathy's early work focused on the social history of reading in America, including her 1986 book, Revolution in the Word, The Rise of the Novel in America, and the 1989 edited volume, Reading in America, Literature and Social History. She's co-editor with Linda Wagner Martin of the Oxford Companion to Women's Writing in the United States and the Oxford Book of Women's Writing in the United States, both 1995. And she served as the general editor of Oxford's Early American Women Writers series, and she co-edited with Jessamine Hatcher the 2002 volume, No More Separate Spheres, a Next Wave American Studies reader. And she collaborated with photographer Bill Bamberger on the 1999 volume, Closing, The Life and Death of an American Factory, which received the Mayflower Cup Award for Nonfiction. And she is the co-author with David Theo Goldberg of 2010's The Future of Thinking, Learning Institutions in a Digital Age. And she has edited Writers' Love Letters. She has written a personal history of her experiences in Japan, but perhaps the most amazing thing is that in and amongst all of this, she served for 8 years as the first vice provost for interdisciplinary studies at Duke University, where she oversaw more than 60 research programs and was instrumental in establishing the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience and the program in Information Science and Information Studies. She is today the Ruth F. DeVarney Professor of English and the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies at Duke, and it seems like no one else could possibly hold both of those positions at one time. And as if that weren't enough, she is co-founder of HASTAC, the Humanities, Arts, Science, and Technology Advanced Collaboratory, an international organization exploring the future of collaborative knowledge networks. And in 2010, she was appointed by President Obama to the National Council on the Humanities. Now, the project that she's here to talk about today is the unofficially, for the moment, best-selling book, Now You See It, The Brain Science of Attention. How the Brain Science of Attention will transform the way we live, work, and learn, which is being praised lavishly everywhere. I'm going to stop there so that your attention can be given to a far more rewarding source. Please join me in welcoming Cathy Davidson.
I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then I would love a lively question and answer period. This is kind of a snapshot of one of those sort of overview books that has lots of points of entry. I'm going to be talking today primarily about learning, but I'm also happy to talk about the science of attention as pertains to the modern, actually the residually unmodern workplace, and also to just various aspects of life in the 21st century. Historian Robert Darnton likes to say, I'm trying to button this so I can make the mic a little less, is that better? I'm hearing a lot of scratching, that's better, great. Historian Robert Darnton likes to say that there are four, I'm not going to read a paper, by the way, don't get nervous that I haven't started the paper yet, this is just a conversation. Robert Darnton likes to say there are four great ages in the history of communication, four great information ages. And when Darnton says this, he goes all the way back to the first one, to the invention of writing in 4000 BC Mesopotamia, which of course everybody knows Socrates didn't like that invention at all. He thought it diminished our powers of knowledge, our ability to exchange knowledge, our memory, and if the word attention had been translatable in ancient Greek, compromised our abilities to pay attention. Darnton likes to say the second great information age happens in 10th century China and in the Renaissance with Gutenberg and the invention of movable type, which again makes a major change in the way we're able to communicate and pass on knowledge. Third information age is the one that I spent a lot of my career working on, which is the invention of steam-powered presses and machine-made paper and ink, which makes books accessible to a wide public for the first time in history. That was such a weird period to study when I studied it that I spent basically 10 years going around the attics of historical societies looking for books so I could find marks in 18th century books to figure out how the first generation of working class and middle class readers actually responded to and learned literacy skills from these cheap little books called duodecimos, which are about sort of the kind of iPhone size. One of my pet things when I was doing the Revolution in the Word was finding dresses and pantaloons that had this special pocket that was designed to hide, to conceal the iPhone, which I like to say, not the iPhone, the duodecimo, which I like to say was the video game of the 18th century, because if you were one of the founding fathers in the 18th century, you were already very worried about what it would mean that people could read without the mediation of a preacher or a politician to tell you how to read those books. These are mass-produced books. The circulating library is the conduit, and then the conduit of reproduction of books so that even working class books could be distributed. Many of the books featured working class heroes. The air conditioning has not come on. Right. And public education. The big justification for public education is, oh my gosh, we have to train people to be educated because now they've got access to this print world, and we have to teach them how to think. We have to teach them, we have to control how they think because they have access to way too much information. My interest in what Darnton calls the fourth information age, and we can quibble about, was the scriptorium, there's lots of ways you can quibble. It's just an interesting schematization to put this in perspective. The fourth information age is now, with the commercialization of the internet and the movement from a centralized broadcast system, whether that's publishers or television or radio, to a broadcast yourself world, where anyone can have an idea and communicate that idea almost instantaneously to anybody who happens to be online, which can be a lot of people. The argument I'm going to make today, and that I make in Now You See It, is that basically we have an educational system that went through radical transformations and in the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, precisely for an industrial age. The creation of the research university, compulsory education, and as we'll see, many other features of the modern educational and apparatus was created specifically to help to train, measure, assess, formulate the industrial subject. And one of the things I want to talk about today is what kinds of transformations we would need if we were going to think about 15 years in how you would transform the contemporary education system for a broadcast yourself world. Okay? What that does to the professorate, what that does to disciplines, what that does to learning, what that does to the model of education, what that does to the model of attention. If you're in a world where interaction happens without the mediation of an editor, of a publisher, of a central node to mediate that broadcast, that way of broadcasting yourself into the world. Before I talk anymore, I'm going to begin with a little exercise. That's why you all have a card and a pencil. This is something I do in my classes. I'll talk about this in the course of the talk. But I'm going to set my very elegant timer for 2 minutes. And I would like you to just, on your card, and there's 3 parts of this exercise. But in the first part, just right now, on your card, think about if you were charged with reforming higher education now for the kinds of students who are coming into your classrooms who can barely, right? If you're a first-year student right now, you were born, what, in 1991? The internet's commercialized 1993, 94, 95. You can argue that date. So this is the first class of entering first-year students who really don't remember a time before the internet. The time before you could, you know, it's getting better and more, but you could Google and find anything, right? Without a research librarian telling you what to think. And you could broadcast anything. So if you were thinking about just what kinds of things you would like to see happening in higher education now, just write down 3 things. Just curious. And I'm going to set this for 2 minutes, so everybody has 2 minutes to write down 3 things. There won't be a test. Promise. It's ringing. I've been teaching a long time and giving a lot of papers. It is so stressful to be here in a silent room when you're supposed to be standing at the front of the classroom. My heart, if you could hear it pounding in the back, it's really stressful. But now, I'm going to do a second exercise. Or I would like you to do a second exercise. I'd like you to turn to the person nearest to you. Ideal if you don't know them, but fine if you do. And I'd like you to look at the 6 things on your card. And I'll set this for 2 minutes again and decide if there's one of those 6 things. Pardon me?
3 on one card, 3 on the other.
Yes, so 6 altogether. Right? And sorry, not 12, 6 altogether. And just talk about those 6 things and come up with one thing between the 2 of you agree on one thing that you think would be the most important or the most salient or the thing you most want as part of this conversation today. So I'm going to set the alarm for another 2 minutes. And we're ringing again. Thank you. Thank you. Excuse me. So the first thing I want to have us think about is the difference between that first exercise and the second exercise. Right? The first exercise is basically the 19th century and 20th century form of education. Right? Right? I mean, Rose, authority figure, makes an assignment. You're writing the correct answers down. Timed, right? Timing is an obsession of 20th century education. You know, think about the concept of the timed test. Where except in education does that make any sense? Right? It's really an interesting idea. Come up with the right answer, timed, right? Okay. The second thing is just the sound of those 2 rooms. The third thing, and the energy level. Believe me, it was a lot less stressful to sit here when you were talking than when you were sitting here silently. That's interesting. A third thing is, in fact, okay, as pedagogy, we know, there have been so many tests about this, so many studies of this, that what you just did, those 2 things, and especially the second one, you are far likely to remember 5 years from now than anything I'm going to say for the next 40 minutes. That's just the case. But it's very hard for most of us to get out of the pedagogy of one person with the knowledge transmitting knowledge. So that's important. Like, what is the objective? What are the goals of the transmission of knowledge? Is it performance or is it learning? Right? We know from tests on learning. We also know that a year from now, when you look back on this test, and if you remember this test, you'll remember, and I love this, that it was your answer, your thing from your cards that the two of you circled, whether it was or not. Because if we remember something, we tend to remember it as ours, right? That's one of the, there are many things we could talk about that. That's fascinating, the way we tend to incorporate memory. And it's great. If there are historians present, that's a really interesting issue for historians. And it's why we can have historians, right? And why each generation can write a history of a past generation, because we do make the past ours in a very specific way. That's true actually neurologically as well as for other reasons. The third thing I want to say is that nobody's brain was hurt in the course of the second exercise, right? Or at least I don't think I caused any brain damage. And there's a lot of garbage, and it really is garbage science. I mean, I'm a huge science groupie. There's nothing I love more than reading the nitty-gritty of how you set up a research experiment. I've spent a lot of the last 10 years in laboratories with scientists, helping to make experiments and being part of experiments. But a lot of the literature on distraction and multitasking, how multitasking is making us shallow, and multitasking is making us lonely, and multitasking is not even good for multitaskers, and multitasking is making us distracted, is just based on specious, first of all, it's often based on self-reporting. Second, it's often based on a baseline of a view of attention that modern neurology does not support. And I'm going to be talking about that in the course of of the next 40 minutes. Also, what you did just then is multitasking, and we do it quite well, right? In a noisy room where you have to do a negotiation with somebody, in many cases you've not met before, right? On a subject you have possibly no expertise in, or have not been asked to talk about before, or your expertise is not certified, right? You were able to exchange information in a way that was useful. That's an incredibly difficult cognitive, emotional experience. And again, nobody with brain was damaged in the course of that exercise. One of the big motivations for writing this book, I did help make the cognitive neuroscience department at Duke, and of course read all the dossiers of all the faculty we hired and the new directors we hired at the department and so forth, and got to know their research very well. Was at the same time that was happening, a lot of stuff was coming out about how multitasking was destroying our world. And the one that really bothered me, and that I felt was morally reprehensible if I could get big about it, was the idea that somehow multitasking was hurting our brain. Because if I'm distracted, I can change that. If I'm lonely, I can change that. But if it's hurting my brain, or worse, if it's hurting my children's brains, right? The brains of young children, that's a horrible thing. It's just a horrible thing. So part of the motivation for this book was to try to figure out how to present to a larger public the best research that's available, and that makes it clear that it is not multitasking. First of all, we don't even know what multitasking is. If we did, if multitasking, if attention and paying attention were easy when there were no distractions at all, the world would have a lot more Buddhas in it, right? Because we do have a lot of information that goes back thousands of years about meditation, right? Eastern traditions of meditation, where you clear the world of all external distraction and you focus inward. And as you all know, that's when the mind goes crazy. Right? To become a Buddha, to reach that state of enlightenment where you can really get rid of all the mind's detritus and all the mind's distraction when you're not distracted by external things, is incredibly difficult. And in the question and answer period, I can do some experiments that will show exactly how difficult that is. In my classes, I use something Howard Rheingold uses in his classes. Howard Rheingold is the author of Smart Mobs, one of the great texts of the information age, where he tells his students at Stanford on the first day of class, close your laptops, close your cell phones, now close your eyes. And he has students sit there for 5 minutes and try to chronicle the chaos behind their eyelids when there are no distractions. And of course you can't do it. You open your eyes and he says, okay, write down everything you thought of for 5 minutes where there were no interruptions, and no one can do the Cambridge neuroscientists, as well as Rakeley at Washington U, actually hook devices up to brains and have found out that about 80% of the brain's neural energy is spent on the brain talking to itself. Changing from actually one external distraction to another external distraction takes about 5% of the neural energy of the brain, just measured in those ways that people are measuring that. So the reason I'm interested in the science of attention, as has happened in previous periods of technological revolution, people are caught by the idea of how we pay attention now. Different words are used in different times, but especially right now, the obsession is with attention, and a little bit I'll be going to the genealogy of the word attention in English. But I want to start by talking about kind of the moment where I decided I wanted to write this book. And you probably all know this experiment. How many people know what's coming? Okay, great. For those who don't know, I'll explain that, and I've got a little twist on it for those who do know. This was an experiment that was first conducted in the 1970s by one of the founders of perceptual and cognitive psychology, Ulrich Neisser. The technology wasn't up to the experiment. People just refused to believe what they were seeing, but refused to believe his results. If you read the first reviews of Neisser's work, they say this is going to change our whole paradigms of attention. And it didn't. People just discounted it. So in 1999, two graduates, one's an assistant professor and one's a graduate student at Harvard, Dan Simons and Chris Chabris, reprised the experiment with video equipment. It's a video you show to your audience. It's about 2 minutes long. 6 people are passing basketballs back and forth, and you ask the audience to count how many times the basketball passes only between people wearing white. Not black, only between people wearing white. Video stops, and then you say to the audience, how many times did you count? 10, people raise their hand, 12, 13, 14. If you got 15 passes, perfect, you counted perfectly. And then the tester says, and who saw the gorilla? In the middle of the experiment, for 9.5 seconds, that's a long time of screen time, a Harvard undergraduate in a gorilla suit walks in among the basketball tossers, makes a face, thumps her chest, and then kind of saunters away. And if you don't know about this experiment and have never seen it before, it's about a 60% likelihood that you will not see the gorilla. You know, it's a great, I mean, they did it with a woman with an umbrella. They did many variations, but the gorilla is just too funny, right? And they know enough about cognitive psychology to know that when you replay it and people see what they missed, they not only realize how unbelievable it is and laugh, but laughter is one of those emotional things that helps you remember something better. So it's not only an experiment, it's a pedagogy. The other thing that's great about the particular gorilla experiment is the percentage of people who have not seen the experiment, who are convinced that if they saw it, they would see the gorilla, which is about 95% now, according to, you know, we all believe we would have seen the gorilla. I have to say, I did see the gorilla the first time. And it's not because I'm good at this. I've taken about 30 attention tests, and I've failed all the other 29. The reason I didn't fail it the day I saw it was because my office, when I was vice provost, happened to be putting on the event. It was an event for distinguished professors where the best and brightest young faculty were presenting their work, and a young neuroscientist named Gauvain Gazeldere, who's a philosopher who does his work over in the medical school, was showing this experiment. And I had one eye kind of on the door, making sure the caterers were doing their job. It was a luncheon, right? I was paying attention to other things. And I'm dyslexic. So I looked at that grainy tape and that experiment. I thought, there's just no way I'm going to get it right, and I've got better things to do. So I was not paying attention. That is the principle, in a nutshell, of attention blindness. If you're not paying attention, you will see other things. That's what attention is. Attention is not just focus. It is unfocused. It is, in fact, screening. It is filtering. It is cutting out and excluding all those things that you're not supposed to be focusing on. Because I wasn't counting basketballs, I saw the gorilla. There are a whole bunch of institutional takeaways from that, and I'll spin out just a few of them. One, as weird as it is to not see the gorilla, believe me, in a room of distinguished professors, where I would say we were in the 90% category for counting the number of basketballs, because right, right? What do professors want to do? They want to get the right answer, right? So people were really like, we got 15, right? It is very, very weird to be the person in the room who sees the gorilla when a lot of very, very smart people are saying it doesn't exist, right? Institutional rule number one, if you want to change the world, pay attention to the person who sees the gorilla. They're often the crazy person. They're often the peripheral person, the marginal person, the person who has very radically different cultural values, the artist, right? There's actually some people are doing really interesting field work on this now. Gamers tend to see the gorilla more than other people. Artists seem to see the gorilla more than other people. People with learning disabilities see the gorilla more than other things. It's all about how we pay attention and how we focus. So paying attention to the person who sees the gorilla. If you're interested in afterwards, and I've been doing some work with Harvard Business Review about this and doing some business consulting on methods that my organization, HASTAC, uses to make sure we always privilege the voice of the person who sees the gorilla. It doesn't happen by accident. You have to structure that. You have to structure it because we don't see what we don't see. So if you're going to even believe something else exists, you have to structure it. You have to build it in. You have to. You'll miss it every time. If you've already seen the gorilla experiment, you can go on YouTube and see the amazing color changing card trick. I don't know if anyone's seen that. It's by another psychologist, Robert or Richard Wiseman. This is one, we've all seen it. It's a kind of like cheesy wedding trick where you pick a card, you show it to the audience, then you put it back in the deck, and the magician magically finds the card. And you all know how that's done? They just switch the deck. So there was a blue deck, and now it's a red deck, so they can pick out your card immediately, and no one knows that. But when they do the amazing changing color card trick on YouTube, they pull back the camera and show you what was really going on. Turned out there were two cameras, and while you were looking at the cards to see how this cheesy magician trick is done, Wiseman and his confederate change their clothes. They literally pull off their sweaters, so they're wearing totally different clothes. The whole background, the whole team of people pulls out the background color, and even the tablecloth on which all this is happening gets changed. And very, very few people notice any of those color changes in the course of the trick. There's another one with airline pilots. You can imagine where this is going. In fact, it's the most common way of training pilots, where you ask the pilot on the simulator to land a plane in very difficult, complicated atmospheric conditions. And you then show them what they missed. And what they missed is just at the end, when everything was fine and they were cruising right into the hangar, there's a big aircraft carrier parked horizontally across the runway. About 70% of pilots land their plane on top of that other plane. A great lesson to learn in a flight simulator, right? I mean, we all want pilots to learn that in a flight simulator. The point is we don't see the world, we see the part of the world we are paying attention to. And attention is not innate, right? I love infant experiments, and there's a lot of them I can talk about. And the last couple of years have been just an incredible outburst of really exciting work in infant, what we know as we're born, in infant knowledge and infant learning. But basically, babies pay attention to everything, right? And what learning is about is training attention. So if you're a parent in English and your baby's going Mada, you don't reward the baby. If the baby says something that's remotely like Dada, you say, he said Dada, look, he said Dada, and you reward that with affection and all kinds of other things. And pretty soon, baby's not worrying about Mada, he's worrying about Dada. One of my favorite experiments is the Japanese baby experiment. Japanese babies can hear the difference between R and L, even though there's no difference between R and L in the Japanese language. Until they're 6 months old, can't hear the R and L difference anymore. It's not in the language, you start screening. That's how all attention and all learning works. I believe that for the last 150, 160, 170 years, we've been systematizing and privileging a form of attention for the industrial age. And that those great institutions of education that existed from medieval times forward, start going through radical changes at the end of the 19th century, very specifically motivated for a certain population to learn how to be comfortable in the industrial age. It's not always saying that kind of education works, but virtually anything you can think about in terms of the institutionalism of knowledge and the forms of higher learning that we have now were pretty much developed in a period roughly from about 1880 to 1914. Clay Shirky likes to say, institutions tend to preserve the problem they were designed to solve. Pretty cool. I mean, institutions tend to preserve the problem they were designed to solve. And basically the problems of the industrial age that higher education in particular are solving are the problems of how you get people to pay a certain kind of focused attention, timeliness, standards, which almost instantly, by 1914, standards and standardization are practically indistinguishable, which is weird in human history, right? When in past times in human history was standardization the bellwether of high standards. It's pretty kind of, and I'm happy to talk about that more. Specialization, expertise, credentialing, right? The invention of the graduate school, the MBA, the School of Education, law schools associated in universities, medical schools, nursing schools, metrics, standard deviation, statistics, the whole world of how we measure what counts as productivity, and the institutionalization of the two cultures, with the humanities, arts on one side, and social sciences and human sciences on one side, and technology, mathematics, science on another. As you all know, in Pythagorean terms, mathematics is a humanities. It should be a humanities. It's weird for mathematics. I was raised as a mathematician. It's kind of an accident that I went into English. It still seems odd to me that mathematics would be considered a science rather than a humanities. It's the boundary between math and philosophy. I don't even know where that is. Nobody does. The two great thinkers, again, I'm just going to touch on this, that I think formulate the ideas of the industrial workplace, and what I'm calling the industrial view of attention, are, of course, William James and Frederick Winslow Taylor. James whines in chapter 11 of the Principles of Psychology that he's the first person in English to write about attention. And he's especially concerned about the opposite of attention. And to talk about that opposite thing, he uses the phrase, what the French call distraction. I've read Principles of Psychology since I was an undergraduate, but it was only when I was doing this book that I saw that phrase and I was just shocked. Because I don't think any of us would say what the French call distraction, could imagine that for 1890. It's not that that word wasn't in English before, but it wasn't in English in the usage that we would use it in now. And James had to go to the French for that concept. Most of what he's talking about in the chapter on attention is precisely the kind of attention that gets distracted from the exterior world. And of course, when we get to Frederick Winslow Taylor, he's not only talking about attention, but attention to task, attention to something specific, a focus on that task, and how we can measure that productivity. So the schoolroom, the symbol of the schoolroom in the 19th century, of course, of education in the 19th century is the school bell, right? Timeliness, because you've got people, you're having to train, especially an agrarian workforce, to figure out, like, why is it important that I get to the office on time? Or to the assembly line, more likely the assembly line on time, right? You know, you get up when the sun gets up, right? You go out into the field. You do what needs to be done that day. If it's shoeing the horse or fixing the fence or plowing a field, you do what needs to be done. Suddenly you're in a world where no, you do what somebody is telling you to do on time, on target, on task, with a specialized attention to detail, and to the details of that task in order that the next person can then do another process. Right? Division of work and labor, all of those divisions we hear about, and we know about. I think probably most people in this audience are aware of Taylor, but I'm just going to read one sentence to just sort of as a reminder of how obsessed with attention to task he is in his time and motion studies, as he called them. Quote, how it's doesn't take much. How long does it take a laborer with a wheelbarrow full of loose dirt to wheel it approximately 100 feet, exactly 240 times in a 10-hour day? Okay. Talk about dividing up work, right, into incredibly discrete tasks that you can measure and then have quotas. And for Taylor, that means if you do a bad job and you don't fulfill your quota, you're a malingerer or a truant. He uses there's another word. Oh, a loafer. A loafer is another word he uses. And you're supposed to be penalized for that. If you do well, you're a soldier, and you get rewarded for that. If you want in the question-answer period, I'm happy to talk about the militarism of all of this and what's happening militaristically at the same time. But fascinating, and not much commented on. That Taylor thought of those who are productively pushing those wheelbarrows 240 times with a quota are his soldiers, the soldiers of the industrial world. I've just been sort of throwing into a slide, there's lots more, but it's not readable, it's barely readable now. A list of sort of the things that get developed in this time period. And it's kind of astonishing. Especially, I mean, compulsory education is a long process. It basically goes from Massachusetts to Mississippi, from 1852 to 1918, where states are requiring compulsory education. But a whole world of other things are invented, formalized, institutionalized during this time period. I think most people know the story of IQ tests, so I'm going to instead focus on something else, which is now our national educational standard, the multiple choice test. I was whining about the multiple choice test, and my editor said, well, who invented the multiple choice test? It really had never occurred to me that there might be a guy who invented the multiple choice test, and it is a guy. His name's Frederick J. Kelly. He was writing a dissertation in 1914 at Emporia State University in Kansas, and there's a crisis. There's a war on. Men are fighting the war. Women who you were teaching are now in the factories. Immigrants are coming into America, and America has just passed a national law requiring 2 years of high school education. There's a crisis. There's no way to do it. So writing his dissertation in Emporia, Kansas, Frederick Kelly says, well, wait, we have a solution here. Henry Ford has invented an assembly line to turn out Model Ts. We need an assembly line to turn out students. The phrase he uses is not a phrase that we would use. He says this is a terrible test. It only tests lower order thinking for the lower orders, quote unquote. But we're in a crisis and we have to process. And my grandmother would have been a student in that generation. One of those lower order thinking people, who was a member of the lower orders. Here's a question from the Frederick J. Kelly item response test, also called the Kansas silent reading test. Circle, and you're supposed to fill in the whole circle. Make sure you don't go outside the line. Make sure you fill in the whole circle, right? Anyone taken a GRE or a SAT lately, or has a kid who's taking an end of grade test? It's still, that little circle thing. And he talks about how you have to fill it in. It's time. Which of these animals is a farm animal? Dog, cow, dinosaur, crocodile. Obviously, right? The only right answer there, because there can only be one, is cow, right? Well, needless to say, if you are a kid growing up on a farm, a dog is also a farm animal, right? And as anyone who's ever taken the Kaplan test, they work, knows what you're taught when you take those tests is not about knowledge, but how to pay attention to a focused, detailed kind of knowledge that excludes right answers because you're only allowed to have the only answer, right? That is our national educational system right now. That is No Child Left Behind's national imperative now. That's how we test all kids, that's how we measure our metrics. It's our gift to the world, right? There's no country on earth now that isn't interested in how kids do on standardized testing. Within 4 years after inventing the Kansas silent reading test, Frederick Kelly is looking around the world and seeing schools of education and schools of business and the college boards. This isn't, actually I'm making a historical merge here, that's in 1929. But all of these institutions are saying his emergency Kansas silent reading test is the right way to test intelligence. he lives a long life. Unlike Binet, who made the IQ test, who died renouncing the IQ test as anything about inherent intelligence, but he died young. Kelly lives many, many, many more years and spends his whole career denouncing this test he wrote as a doctoral student. In fact, he becomes head of the University of Idaho and tries to put a kind of, president, becomes a kind of a Dewey-esque, learn by doing, interactive, collaborative, take a card and write 3 things on it, talk about it with a neighbor kind of education, and he gets fired. The faculty run him out and say, no, this is not scientific, this is not the modern world. And he loses his job and becomes a government bureaucrat after that. But too late, right? That is our national educational testing system. So if we're at a juncture where that kind of labor, that kind of education is less and less useful, what do we do about it? Right? If we have an institution that was made for a certain kind of labor, what do we do about a world where labor rules, labor organization has changed? Not always in a good way, not in a bad way. I'm not even going to talk about that. It has changed. In the course of doing research for Now You See It, I thought, I want to find the stodgiest, most boring industrial age company and see, has it really changed? So I thought, of course, IBM, right? The only company from the from the past to survive into the present. Also, it's a great metaphor because I'm an English teacher, right? IBM invented the punch clock. So what better company to study ethnographically than IBM? Probably most of you don't know this. I didn't know it. 40% of IBM workers no longer badge in. 40%. That's kind of amazing. IBM almost went, it's a story been told many times, IBM almost went bankrupt in the 90s, was still trying to be the behemoth of the industrial age and realized it had to change its way of doing things. Again, I can make all kinds of critique of the change, but the very fact that 40% of IBM's workers no longer punch a clock, no longer work in an office, is pretty interesting given the fact that we're still training people as if that world of labor has not changed. And again, I keep getting called a techno-optimist. I actually don't think I'm a techno-optimist. I'm not a techno-determinist. I think it's ridiculous to think that technology damages our brains or runs our lives. We have to learn to control it. New labor rules are something we have to develop. It took 100 years to develop labor laws for the last century and for the industrial age, and we've gotten rid of most of those, and most of those protections, unfortunately, with neoliberalism. But we have to rethink what protection is like, labor protection and protecting a workforce is like in a world where IBM has 40% of its workforce badging in. What does that look like? How do you teach for participation in the World Wide Web? How do you learn for participation in the World Wide Web? One thing I did in the course of researching this book is I spent lots of time in companies and labs, in schools, K through 12 as well as higher education, and I talked to a lot of great people about the world we live in. I talked to Jimmy Wales, spent a couple days with Jimmy Wales, who of course invented Wikipedia, and I said to him, "What did you know? Did you have any idea in 2002 that you would be making the world, you would be the leader of the biggest encyclopedia the world has ever known, and one that's made," think about this in terms of rational choice economic theory, that's made voluntarily, without recompense, no one gets paid to do it, edited for free by another group of people who are editing entries, and that the American Library Association now says is as reliable as any other existing encyclopedia. And by the way, talk about an institution that's gone through amazing change, and kudos. If any organization in the world should feel threatened by the world we live in, it should be librarians, right? I mean, the reference librarians. And at first, the reference librarians were very opposed to Wikipedia. And then but they're reference librarians. They know how to do research. And they did the studies again and again, and now are saying Wikipedia is as accurate as anything else that's out there. Plus, it's 282 languages. It's used by 90,000 people have contributed to Wikipedia around the world. It's an amazing thing. No one knew. No one even knew that human nature allowed such a thing to happen. That's the one I think is interesting. I also talked to Tim Berners-Lee, person who wrote HTML for the World Wide Web. I said, did you know? No idea that you could build a massive collaborative system with participatory labor from people you didn't meet and didn't know. There's a famous story everyone tells about this great code that's getting written from somewhere. It seemed like it was in Japan, but nobody knew who was doing it. And it turned out to be Joey Ito, who's now one of the kind of leaders of the information age, who was a 16-year-old dropout, who just was a genius and was writing code and helping to write the World Wide Web. Kind of amazing. I now work with Mozilla Foundation a lot, which of course makes your browser, the Firefox browser, it's all open source, it's nonprofit, et cetera, et cetera. I love the articles of governance for the Mozilla Foundation. Quote, Mozilla is an open source project governed as a meritocracy. Our community is structured as a virtual organization where authority is distributed to both volunteer and employed community members as they show their abilities through collaboration and contribution to this project. Who ever heard of that as a business model? Right? And it now has a 30% share of the world's use of browsers. It's close to beating out Microsoft and the Internet Explorer browser. If it weren't for China, which is way, way behind in terms of browser technology, it would be #1 in the world. That's kind of amazing, done primarily from volunteer contribution. If you want to talk to the president, the head of the Mozilla Foundation, you can call him any Monday at 11 o'clock. He sits by a phone and is willing to talk to anybody. If you want to go to Wikipedia, as I did, I called Jimmy and said, I want to do an ethnographic study of Wikipedia. And I went and visited Wikipedia. I go into this little room that's like, half the size of this room. There's like 12 people at computers. I said, I'd love a tour. And they're like, hi, end of tour. That's it. That's the headquarters of Wikipedia. It's kind of amazing, right? Think about the institutions we staff and how many people are involved. Very interesting. So it's Jimmy Wales and it's Tim Berners-Lee, but I also wanted to talk to ordinary people who were actually doing institutional change in their lives that they didn't even know they were capable of. Not just teachers and people in the world of business, developers, architects, artists, who were just saying, what are the possibilities and how can I mine those possibilities? And I spent 5 years meeting really extraordinary and interesting people. One of them, this is just like helpful, this is like the here's Heloise helpful hint for the day. One of them is Asa Raskin. His dad invented the Macintosh computer, so this is not exactly an ordinary guy. Jeff Raskin is his dad. Asa invented the tabs on your Mozilla browser. He's 20, I think maybe he turned 25. I said, okay, Asa, big shot, you made the tabs on my browser. How do you organize your office? Everybody says multitasking is driving them crazy. How do you organize this to office? He's like, easy. I've got one screen that only has my work for the day, the code I'm writing or whatever else I'm doing. It's not connected to the internet. He said I have to turn to look at my email because I know I get transfixed by my work and that's bad for my body. So I force myself to turn and look at my email. And he said, and then if I want to write my blog or do Twitter, that's on my cell phone that I keep down the hall because it forces me to work during the day. In other words, this is one of the world's great taskers. It helps us learn how to multitask, and he's smart enough to take control of his own tools to figure out a way that works for him, doesn't necessarily work for anyone else, but works for him. Actually, I do that now, and I find it very useful. But it forces him to move his body, which he finds is one of the big problems. Not damaging his brain, but he says his neck is getting damaged from spending too much time, so he's figured out a way to do it. All the people I end up profiling and researching in this book are people who come up with pretty simple ways of controlling a technology in their life. One has gotten a lot of airplay lately, and I'm so happy. His name is Thorkild Sone, who runs a company called Specialistern. Sone was a software developer who realized that his child, who was autistic, was never going to have a livelihood, severe autistic. And then realized that his child was able to read software code that he was writing in a way that no machine could, and that was incredibly accurate, and he loved doing it. And Sone gave up his other job and had started a corporation called Specialistern that only employs autistic people, who now actually make a very good living. It's in Denmark, but it's actually, there are many of them now around the world. He's shown how to do this around the world, where people do software development and are rather contemptuous. He hires people who are also translators between the autistic workers and so-called NTs, which is autistic terminology for derogatory terminology for so-called normal people. NT is a neurotypical. He hires managers who can help the autistic people cope with the nincompoops, NTs who are distractible, who spend all their time at the water cooler, who aren't getting their jobs done, who don't realize this is exciting, and who do a really bad job doing software performance testing. But it's like all the people that I found most inspiring, it's a social issue, a human issue. It's also a technology issue. But those are not inseparable. They have to be looked at together. The humanity, the capacity, all of those things have to be looked together. And also, like that gorilla experiment, it means that person who sees the gorilla, who's different, might not be autistic, but might be the best software performance evaluator in the world. Right? Certainly that's another one of our legacies of the industrial age, is the labeling of abilities in more and more narrow way. If you're a student at Duke or University of North Carolina, the State University, 11 miles from Duke and probably at NYU, 26% of you, if you're a first-year student, are likely to have consulted, been diagnosed with, or been treated with medication for a learning disorder. That's just sick. I'm sorry. If the best and brightest in our country, over a quarter of them, have been diagnosed with a learning disability, we've got a real problem. And I don't actually think it's learning disability as much as it's the legalization of direct-to-consumer drug ads on television, the U.S. and New Zealand. I talk about that a lot. That was one of the other people I interviewed. Insurance adjusters I interviewed, and the people who make direct-to-prescription drug ads, because those are the distraction experts, right? The FDA requires you to say the side effects in drug ads, and most of the best information on intention comes from the people that have to make those ads. Because if you don't want people to pay attention to side effects, you've got a real narrative problem. How do you tell a story in a drug ad and get people to ignore the side effects? Well, you do it by finding out that people really only pay attention to 9.3 seconds of an ad. That's Draft FCB that does the Cymbalta ad. That's their slogan, 9.3 seconds. And you make an ad that's almost 2 minutes long. And you figure out how to get people to focus on the 9 seconds that you want, which is basically depression hurts, Cymbalta can help. Which look, anyway. So another person I interviewed was Dennis Quaintance. The challenge I set myself, and actually my editor set me, was find somebody whose world has nothing to do with the internet. I thought a builder, a construction worker. Then I'm driving home one day, and on the local radio station is this story about Dennis Quaintance from Greensboro, North Carolina, who's a builder. And I knew I had to go interview him. Because Dennis Quaintance was 40 years old. He and his wife had twins. They're walking down the riverbank one day, pushing their twins in a stroller, and his wife says, "Well, do you think our kids are going to admire us when they grow up?" And Quaintance says, "I'm successful. I've got this business. I employ 60 workers, and they employ even more workers, and I'm important." And she says, "What about the environment?" And they start talking and realize that he's never, in any of the developments he's made in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is not New York, it's Greensboro, North Carolina, he's never worried about sustainability. And he just put a bid on a hotel, $30 million hotel in Greensboro, and decided he wanted to make it sustainable. He doesn't have a high school diploma. Most of the people he works with are rural North Carolina people who are not educated people, not an environmentalist among them. They went to the internet, found out how to be sustainable. But there was a difference, because Quaintance decided he would absorb the risk. Normally his workers all his contractors, electricians, plumbers, and so forth, work on a cost-plus contract, meaning if you go over the deadline or over the budget, you pay not only the cost of that, but a penalty. He would take away the penalty if they came up with sustainable electricity, plumbing, HVAC, all of the things of the construction trade. They built a hotel. They named it proximity because they found out that if they were willing to find and train local workers, they were even more likely to be sustainable. So it meant it was great for the local economy. They called in the people that give the LEED awards, L-E-E-D, leadership and environmental, I don't know what that stands for. And they were awarded the world's only platinum LEED designation for a hotel. 60 men and women in Greensboro, North Carolina who knew nothing about this but had a goal and learned about it on the internet and did it. And it's the world's only platinum LEED hotel. When I interviewed Quaintance, I said, you know, so what did you learn? He said, well, the crazy thing is it wasn't that hard. And that's a good thing and a bad thing. The good thing is they did it. The bad thing is, why isn't everybody doing it? It wasn't that hard. Why isn't? What blinders do we have that make it seem like these things are going to be hard? Also, the cost overrun on the hotel was $1 million. He made it back in environmental costs within a year. I've stayed at the hotel. I'm a design snob. I mean, it's a hotel that would be beautiful by New York standards. And what's amazing is it feels like you're at the beach. The air quality feels like you realize you've never been in a building that's not toxic and that really feels like real air, real human air. It's an amazing experience to stay there. I think that the people that I talk to in this book are not extraordinary, and that actually we all do know ways that we can make change and make a world. And I mean, just curious, I would love to hear some of the things you wrote on your card about what would happen if we tried to make institutional changes in education for all. Just shout out. Anyone have some things on their cards? It doesn't have to be big things. Yes? Were you going to say? Anybody want to say what they wrote on their card? Wow, what a shy audience. I've not had that before. Anyone? Yes?
Well, I wrote iPads and e-readers to replace textbooks.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Great. Someone else?
What was the question on the I was too late.
Oh, we had to do it. We did a whole exercise at the beginning. Sorry.
What was the question?
3 things that you would do to transform higher education for this age. If the institutions we've inherited are institutions shaped for an industrial age, what you would do to transform education for this age. Someone else? Yes?
To integrate multimedia into teaching and learning in a way that urges students to not take anything for granted, but rather to think critically about that media.
Great. Great.
Can I say something that is not... the first person talked about e-readers, but first of all, maybe we should change the way e-readers are. Because I have a student who refused to look at the books I wrote who are now e-book, because it takes a long time.
No, I agree with you completely. Actually, that's one of the reasons I don't consider myself a techno-optimist. I think most of our technology sucks. And I was asked by, I think maybe Wall Street Journal, what my ideal occupation would be. I said, I could do anything right now. I'd love to be the CEO of Open Apple. I'd like beautiful Apple products that were gorgeous, but that actually interface with the rest of the world. You know, instead of being lockboxed, stupid, siloed kinds of products that don't allow flash, the e-reader's an ignorant technology. Nobody reads the way we think it's exciting, and it solves some, I'm going to turn the page. I mean, it's crazy, right? I mean, we need better technology, and one reason we have to be informed, and this is not to reject the idea, one reason we have to be informed is so we can demand better stuff instead of going, ooh, it's wonderful, or ooh, it's hurting my brain. We need to take charge of these things. We need to know stuff in order to think critically and actually also make the technology serve us instead of the other way around. Yes?
I'm just wondering what your explanation is for that, because I find every use of technology is so clunky. Certainly in education, the interface...
It's terrible. I know.
And it seems to be going in the wrong direction as far as...
Yes, that's one of my polemical points. Yes. We're about 15 years in, which is actually right on time in the history of technology for starting to think about institutional change and being a little less awed and thinking about things. Because 15 years in, you start having your own kids or your own students who don't say, well, before and after. They don't know. They want to know, like, what about this? Look at all the problems with this. Look at all the things that aren't working. And I'm in the question and answer period. I would love to come back to that question. I've got lots of ideas about that. Yes.
Maybe incorporating media literacy, kind of, and how to take and interpret different forms of media.
Great. Thank you. That's a good one. Any other things? Any other comments anyone wants to shout out? Shout out.
Project-based courses where students work together to solve one problem. And I was just thinking a cool course would be to have students design an e-reader.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. An e-reader that works and that's worth our time and worth our $400 or whatever it is and isn't controlled by Amazon and isn't a device to get you to buy more books from Amazon. It's a great one. We tell young children to play well with others, and then we divide, we tell them what percent. As soon as they get to first grade, they know what percent they're in, and judge them entirely on individual achievement. And then they go into the workforce, and every CEO says, or business recruiter says, how come people don't know how to work together? Well, you've got 12 years in training in how not to work together. The point I want to make is this is not about the future. It's about now, changes that have already happened. It's here. And if we don't take more charge of the world and start thinking about equitable, creative, critical, interesting ways to change our institutions, to think about technology and its interface with institutions, we're missing an incredible opportunity and kind of deserve what we get if we don't take that opportunity. I mentioned that Clay Shirky quote, that institutions tend to preserve the problem they were designed to solve. I actually think institutions are us. That as impervious to change as institutions seem to be. In fact, one reason I talk to people like Dennis Quaintance is we can make changes, and we are able to. And part of institutionalization is to make us feel like we can't. But I guess the part of me that's optimistic isn't optimistic about technology. It's optimistic about the potential for change. And in some ways, change is very difficult. In other ways, I think Dennis Quaintance might be right, that the sad and the happy thing is, in the end, it's really not that hard. Thank you.